What's going on, everyone? I'm pleased to bring you Bob Ramstad from OZ Seattle. He was one of the first shops to open in Washington State and one of the first to open in the entire country with a focus on recreational cannabis. Now, in this episode, we talk about a lot of things such as his thoughts on legalization and what the future holds for America, things like how to differentiate yourself from other dispensaries in the space, and also his learnings from the 9 years of being a dispensary owner. He's also looking for a new shop because his existing shop was taken hold by some landowners building a new condo. So if you like this episode and you like what Bob has to say, please reach out to me and we can get something done. Now, on to the episode. Bob, welcome to the Dispensary Marketing Podcast. Thanks for coming on.
You're absolutely welcome. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So, what are your keys to running a successful dispensary?
Well, at least here in Washington State, there are enough dispensaries out there that there's lots of possibilities for differentiation. And as far as I'm concerned, the last thing you want to do is run a dispensary that's just like every other dispensary. Anything that you can do to create either making the dispensary, the store, more memorable, just period, something that makes people remember, so that when somebody goes, oh yeah, I went to this dispensary, blah, 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 in this neighborhood, that somebody else might immediately go, oh, you mean the one with the, XYZ, or anything that you can do to differentiate yourself in terms of product selection or kind of like overall direction for the way that you kind of portray your shop. And so in particular with our shop, we tried, our shop was dog friendly. And in Seattle, that's a big deal. Lots of people have dogs. So telling people that we're dog friendly and having dog treats and all that, and having our own dog there sometimes when we were open. There's a kind of a shop dog that would come in with one of the employees. And so that was something that we, absolutely, pictures of the dog behind the counter on the internet, and people would come in and go, oh, look, the dog's here. That was kind of a something people knew. And along the same lines, bike friendly. We advertised that we were bike friendly. We let people bring their bikes into the shop. We had a ramp that came up to the front doors so people could just walk right in with bikes. We had an area where people could lean bikes up, and so they didn't have to worry about somebody messing with their bike or stealing their bike or something while they were in the shop. So that was, that was another thing that we did. And those weren't all that terribly unusual, but we also did kind of position ourselves as being a neighborhood shop. We didn't have a bunch of locations. We just had one. I think that kind of helped in terms of developing customer loyalty because we were kind of tucked into a neighborhood and we weren't some giant shop with a big parking lot or whatever. We kind of leaned into that a little bit. And then along those lines too, our product policies and our merchandising and the way we kind of attacked things was definitely something where we were trying to make sure that everything in the building was something that we were happy to sell, that we ourselves would consume. We did not have lower price point stuff that was not good, but just there to make a certain price point. We also didn't have anything that was ridiculously expensive and not that good. So we emphasized to folks that all of the staff were regular cannabis users, and that everything we sold was something that we ourselves would buy and use, even if we didn't, have a shop. And so that, again, that kind of matches up with the neighborhoody sort of feel that we were trying to get, which is, if you wanted the cheapest ounce in Seattle, you'd get in your car and drive somewhere. But if you wanted something that was just solid quality at a reasonable price point, you could walk 2 blocks from your apartment and be at our shop. And that was, the vast majority of our customers were folks that were from the immediate area, or they used to live in the immediate area, got used to our shop, moved out of the area, and now came back, specifically to shop at our store. We had a lot of expats, as we referred to them, folks that, they would, maybe they still had like a doctor or a massage person or something like that in the neighborhood that they saw, and they would make a point of whenever they were in the neighborhood to see them, they drop by our place and buy stuff. And as one person said, they were like, if I just need a joint or a cartridge or something, I'll go to the place that's near my house. But when I get paid and I want to spend $300 on cannabis stock up for the month, I'm going to make a point of coming down here and buying stuff from you guys, because I know, I know I'll be happy with everything I bought. So those were the things that we really emphasized. We tried to do some things to differentiate our shop from every other shop in terms of kind of how we functioned, and then we were also very editorial in our product selection. And that was somewhat born of necessity because we weren't a physically giant shop. But it was also, I think that's one of the most important things a retailer can do, is to, emphasize the good stuff. And folks would come in and ask for, brand X, and we'd be like, we don't like brand X. We have products from other brands that we think are better. And they might be a few bucks more, but they might actually be a similar price or less. We did a lot of business with smaller producers that didn't really have a toehold in King County. And in some cases, we were by far, even though we were one small shop, by far we were moving the most volume for those smaller producers, which we really liked. We liked to support those smaller producers, and it also served to give our customers something that they weren't going to find at other places.
Right. So the big thing is the key differentiation. So I would love to hear about so you're talking about, dog friendly, bike friendly. Obviously you want products that you can't get, in your regular, let's say, big corporate shop, if you will. When you first got started, did it come into your mind that you needed to accomplish these things, or was this like a lot of trial and error that kind of led you to deciding that those were the things that needed to happen for you to run a successful business?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Washington State was one of the first to legalize, along with Colorado. We did it very differently here than in Colorado, because in Colorado they basically immediately grandfathered all of their medical folks in and allowed them to get recreational licenses. So they had a much bigger shop footprint right away than we did in Washington State. In Washington State, there was lengthy period of time with applications and lotteries and everything else. And one of the things, Seattle initially had 21 licenses, and we were probably around 10th to open, somewhere in that area. So we were early, but not super, super early. And it absolutely is the case that when we first opened, I couldn't do what we had originally planned to do. And the reason for that was the number of stores was so small that we were drawing from a much bigger geographic area. And we had a much wider range of customers than was kind of our target market. And so we absolutely had to kind of bend some of our purchasing in the less expensive direction, actually bringing in some things that were brands that people liked that we didn't think were all that great but they were inexpensive. And we essentially had to do that just because of the volume of people. Half the people that came in on a given day might ask for something cheaper than anything we had on the shelf. So in a roundabout way, I'm answering your question. Yeah, absolutely. I went into it with the idea that we were going to differentiate based on editorial and selection, and that we were going to make selections that were quality products that represented good value. And that was kind of the watchword, value in the sense that, if it's a less expensive item, it's still better than you would expect for what you paid. And if it's a more expensive item, you're paying something, but the quality of that product is as high as anything, even the most expensive stuff in the marketplace. It's just as good. So that was always the plan. And a lot of that was driven off of what was already occurring. So like I said, we were around 10th and we were paying attention to what other folks were doing. And what we saw a lot of was shops that were very, very much emphasizing and in bed with what were already fairly large producer processors. And they were producer processors that had really complicated product lines where they were already offering, flower and joints and fortified joints and cartridges and edibles, and the list goes on and on. And so that a given shop would carry the full line from like 3 of those large producer processors, and that would fill all of their shelf space. And from our end, it didn't make any sense to sell something that you could go a half a mile to a competitor and buy, right? I mean, it's just, that doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense. And B, there were tons and tons and tons. I mean, when we first got our license and started receiving samples, we received hundreds and hundreds of submissions in the first few weeks from smaller farms. And uniformly, they were all then and even now, I wouldn't say complaining, but they were just constantly talking about how difficult it was to get into shops, how difficult it was to even get anybody to try their samples. And so I looked at all of that and was like, well, there's, one logical outcome to that data, which is I should be looking really hard at these smaller farms. And yeah, it was absolutely true that in the early going, even though we didn't have anybody in-house yet, we would have to try 10 or 15 samples before we found something that was worth pursuing. And then sometimes we would like the sample and we go look at the price list and we'd be like, okay, well, that's not going to work. So there was a lot of effort that went into what we did. But then again, that kind of, what would end up happening later is people would ask me kind of like similar questions to what you're asking me, essentially. I'd be like, look, I don't think what we're doing is all that complicated or all that unusual or even all that hard to understand. What we're doing, it's just work. I mean, it is actual work. And a lot of people are just not willing to do the work. And we saw later shops opening where I swear to God, what they did is they, got on Headset or something like that, looked up the 100 best-selling items in Washington, and then they stocked those, right? And I'm sorry to the people who went and did that. I mean, I get the efficiency of it, but you're not doing anything for the industry. You're not doing anything for the customer. You're not evolving anything. You're not improving anything. You're just riding off the back of the data And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where, frankly, some of the best-selling products in Washington State are just garbage. They're just not very good. And it's just because they're cheap. And then conversely, some of the best-selling products in Washington State are fantastic and worth every penny. And to never have tried the products in question and just gone and ordered a bunch of stuff because it's bestseller, that's kind of a terrible way to go.
Right. I have a question for you. I have a general hypothesis on kind of how new the industry is as a whole, right? Like just cannabis, legal cannabis and stuff like that. Up until recently, it was a guy who's like, hey, I know a guy that can give us some stuff.
Right.
And a lot of the things that you were talking about just now was like the price to value discrepancy, right? Like, can you pay a couple dollars more for something that is perceived as more valuable, right? And I think in like the alcohol market, for example, you have your craft beers, but then you have all different types of alcohol. You have different types of whiskeys and vodkas and rums of different levels of hierarchy. And like people kind of know just based on like what they see. But when it comes to cannabis, it's a little bit more tricky where it's like, okay, like that looks good. But my thoughts are right now in terms of the maturity of the market is that I feel it's a lot more difficult to showcase that value that you speak of, if that makes sense. Like, sure, we can talk about the different terpene profiles and how the highest THC thing isn't the only thing that you need to focus on and all of these different things. But ultimately right now, kind of like what I'm seeing, it's very much where's the highest THC product for the cheapest, for the cheapest amount possible, right?
Yeah.
So did you find it difficult to showcase the value? Like essentially you doing the work is one thing, but the customer realizing the value of what you've done is a completely separate thing. So were you having troubles, with the non-connoisseurs, let's say, trying to not even convince them, but just showcase that like we are going out of our way to find products that are not just on the top 100 list. Just give it a shot. Were you having any struggles with that? Is that kind of aligned? Is that,
Well, let's hit on a few different things. So with respect to craft beer or whiskey or wine, those all have, particularly now with the internet and social media, those all have large groups of folks who post and discuss all the time about every single freaking release, every single brewery, every single distillery, every single winery. They all have followings. They all have critics. They all have people who are excited about certain releases, not about other releases. Other people who think this is overhyped or is a good value or whatever. And I know personally when I go out to, it's not unusual for me to look up, particularly if I'm going to spend some real money, to look up what people think. If I'm in a liquor store and there's an interesting bottle of whiskey and I've never heard of it before, I'll pull up the internet and say, Old Forester 1824 100 proof, and boom, I'll have 15 different people telling me different things about it, and I can learn that way. The cannabis industry is slowly but surely developing those people. And in fact, I would argue that a bunch of our customers were and are people who are kind of early, in that. It was not unusual for us to have, every few weeks or certainly once a month, somebody come in, talk to us for a while, buy a bunch of 1 grams or eighths, take a bunch of pictures of stuff, and for us later to discover that they had written some lengthy, article about the farms and the strains and their experience at our shop and everything else. And so that's, I guess in a way that's kind of my criticism of the places that are buying the top 100 or whatever, is they're not developing a connoisseur. They're not developing a discerning customer. And a healthy industry where people can actually make money, make a living, and there are differentiations in the different products that are out there that make it worth the extra money. It really depends on customers becoming educated. And you're absolutely correct that, folks would come in and they'd say, do you have anything with 30% THC or higher? And we would say, we do not. And honestly, anybody who tries to sell you that is pretty much lying, because, from a biology perspective, the highest the plant can go is about 32%. And after that, it can't make any more THC without dying. And then we know that labs cheat. We know that farms, whether they actually pay the lab to cheat, or whether the lab just knows that if the number comes back too low, they're going to stop doing business with them. It doesn't really matter. The outcome is the same. You end up with bogus numbers. And so some folks would hear us say that, and we would have a dialogue, and that person had a decent chance of becoming our customer. And other people would hear that, and they would just hear, oh, we don't have anything over 30%, and they just leave. And similarly, people would come in and say, what's the highest THC you have right now? And we'd be like, in all seriousness, we were selling 70 or 80 different strains typically. And then obviously each batch is a different THC. So at any given moment, we might have had 200 or 300 different THC numbers. And we would tell folks, actually, I don't know what the highest THC is. Let's look at the menu. And we'll pull up the menu and start looking at it. Typically we'd start by looking at the indicas, because they tend to express way more THC. And also usually the people who are asking for the highest THC were people who are looking for indicas. And then we would find it, and we would say, this is the highest THC, and sell it to them. And sometimes we would say, look, if you're looking for something that's strong, that's different than THC. THC is not a measure of strong. It's not like proof for alcohol. And again, sometimes customers would go, oh, really? What do you mean by that? And we would have a dialogue, and we might end up with a really good long-term customer that starts expressing some, personal preferences and some understanding of how cannabis is different from strain to strain and farm to farm. Or they might be not interested at all, and we might make a quick sale and never see them again. So a lot of what was going on for us was that process of kind of teaching people how to be able to make purchasing decisions. And I think one of the things that was probably most surprising to some of our customers was them figuring out that there were certain farms that they liked, and they liked the cure, and they liked the style of the trimming, and they liked the way that the plant was handled and processed and treated. And that they would then experiment with styles of cannabis that they hadn't, they primarily were an indica smoker, but we had something that sounded interesting that was more of a hybrid, and they tried it because they liked the farm. And now all of a sudden they're like, oh, I kind of get it. I kind of get why, I can smoke that in the afternoon and not, go for a nap on my couch. And the main reason they did was because they liked that farm, and they were in to buy, a quarter of the thing they normally buy. And the staff was raving about some interesting hybrid that we had just gotten in from them, and they decided to pick up a gram of that. So they learned something. Yeah.
Oh, that's super, super insightful. Running a dispensary is harder than ever. There are competitors popping up all over the place. So to help you with this, I've talked to 100 dispensary owners from coast to coast, and I developed this 6-stage marketing plan to help you increase your online orders, increase revenue, and also help you have a lineup of people outside your door. So if this is something you want, please check out the links now. I want to go back a little bit because you mentioned your, first 10, let's say, in Seattle. I'm getting a lot of inquiries from, newer dispensary owners, on the east side, the New Jersey, New York, Buffalo, so on and so forth, because they're kind of going through their round of legalization. How would you kind of categorize the different buckets of years from when you first started to now in terms of how the environment changed. So for example, you first started, minimal competition, there wasn't really too much, maybe had a lineup of people outside your door, the novelty was still there, the novelty with your employees and staff were still there. They're like, I can work for a dispensary. And then, you know, maybe fast forward 6 months, the honeymoon phase is done and they realize it's still a customer facing job and all that fun stuff. You know, looking back, you know, what did those different transitionary periods look like for you? And, you know, is there anything you would have done differently, maybe from year 2 to year 3, year 3 to year 4, and so on and so forth?
Yeah. So one of the things I've always believed, and it a lot, you're right, some of it is perception, is that, you know, as a retailer for cannabis, the retail part is 90% of the job. The cannabis part is really a pretty small part. There's a bunch, because it's cannabis, and the cannabis part really falls into 2 sections. One is product knowledge, which is very specific, and compliance, which, you know, we have a much higher compliance burden than any other business on the face of the planet, except for maybe casinos. Casinos are probably would be the easiest analogy for the kind of level of scrutiny that the state governments, you know, the insight that they want into what you're doing, and the fact, like here in Washington State, I mean, basically the state can send folks in at any time for any reason to look at anything, and you are not only expected to comply, but essentially roll out the red carpet and make their job easy. So in the early going, you're right. There was certainly a novelty factor. I think I would also say, and this is, it's an interesting observation, but I think in some ways it's obvious. There were lots and lots of people that were essentially lapsed stoners, people for whom the time, energy, effort, and legal risk of obtaining cannabis was too high for the amount of enjoyment that they thought that they would get from cannabis. So they had just stopped trying to, they didn't like operating in the black market. And, you know, they didn't know anybody who knew anybody, et cetera, to make any kind of introductions. And so a lot of those folks essentially kind of came home when legalization occurred. And they were folks that in some cases hadn't smoked any kind of cannabis or vaped anything for years, you know, 5, 10, 15 years. Because they had just kind of fallen out of the habit, didn't have anybody good to get anything from, etc. And so that was, I think, a lot of the initial excitement over legalization was the realization from these folks that they could just walk in like it was a liquor store, buy however much they wanted within reason, and walk out and have it be just a normal transaction, you know, not meeting somebody behind some big box store and getting some sort of wad of something wrapped up in saran wrap, you know, from the back of somebody's Buick or something. Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty old school. I totally remember the bad old days and exactly how. I mean, I have friends who went to prison, you know, for years and years and years, and you know, for growing or for dealing, and just, you know, all sorts of, you know, terrible personal stories for people I know well. So anyways, what then happened, which I think is interesting, is, yes, the novelty wore off, but what it really was that, you know, some folks who had, you know, memories of really enjoying cannabis when they were in college or when they were just out of college in their first job or whatever, they realized that the kind of cannabis that they were now getting in a shop wasn't working for them, given their current lifestyle. Maybe now they have kids, or maybe now they run a company or something, and so they staying up late at night watching stoner comedies is something that is harder to do when you have more responsibility. So some of those folks dropped out of the market after only being in it for 3 to 6 months. Others decided that remember, everything was really expensive at the start. Other folks got reintroduced to it through the legal market and then went to the black market. And at least here in Seattle, Vancouver, BC and Western Washington kind of created and pioneered hydroponics in North America. Amsterdam and folks over there were the ones who really got it rolling because of their peculiar legal structures over there. But then it was folks here that really grabbed it and ran with it and started producing, in much larger quantities. And then you also had a lot of folks here, just like in Amsterdam, who were specializing in genetics. And in particular, genetics specifically for indoor propagation. So, we have folks in our neighborhood here and in the neighborhood over where my store was that have been growing cannabis illegally for 50 years. These are folks that are in their 60s and 70s they really know what they're doing. Is the upshot. And because they don't have any compliance burden and they don't have any tax burden, they can sell you an ounce of something really quite amazing, for maybe $150, something like that. And in a shop, you'd pay $300 for that same ounce. And so there were folks who, now that it was legal, they were willing to look at things that are technically illegal in Washington state, but that nobody is prosecuting anybody for it. And because of the quantities they were going through and their desire to have a little bit more kind of control, know your farmer. There's something really nice about actually knowing the person that you're buying from, maybe being able to actually see the plants, and then also, honestly, some of the larger producers in Washington state kind of shot themselves in the foot. In the sense that they were churning out stuff really fast. It wasn't cured very well, or their genetics weren't very careful with their genetics. And so they'd have a bunch of different strains with different names, but a lot of it would smoke very similar to one another. And so that's the sort of thing that would push people to go find these other options. So then prices started to fall, and we definitely saw a lot of shops that were primarily competing on price. And then from what I could tell, that also kind of created a situation where quite a few of the shops, kind of the quality of the staff and the whole interaction kind of went down a little bit. Because they weren't able to retain people, they weren't paying, giving people regular raises and stuff like that, because they were having trouble making ends meet. And unfortunately now, in Washington state, from what I can tell, we're in a little bit similar situation to, say, Colorado, Oregon. Those two are the best analogies. California has a lot of problems, but that's not the one that's the most similar to us, where it's a fairly mature market. The margins have all kind of been driven off into small margins, and so it's harder and harder to actually make any money as a retailer. And it's, of course, been impossible as a farmer in those states, our state, Colorado, and Oregon, just because of oversupply. And so what you're having now is a situation where shops have to be a certain size. They have to get to a critical mass to be able to really function. And smaller shops are finding it harder and harder to stay afloat.
It's not the green rush everyone thought it would be, when this all first started.
Well, and I would say that, and not to turn this explicitly political, but there were a lot of folks, me included, who thought there was a very good chance that if Kamala Harris had been elected, that the Biden administration at the end of it would take the various recommendations and deschedule cannabis or make it Schedule 3. And either of those would have made 280E not be a thing. And it would have immediately meant that lots and lots of smaller shops would have gone from being unprofitable to being profitable. And it would have massively helped in this attempt to, rein in the black market and the gray market economy. And my primary concern on those, honestly, is safety. Just the fact that a lot of folks cut corners when they are doing something illegal. They are more worried about attracting scrutiny than they are about safety. And so things like, being able to inspect all of your lighting all the time and make sure that all your electric is up to code, and make sure that, it happens all the time that people get injured or even killed in black market operations because of bad decisions that are made to cut corners. And then there's also things like proper ventilation and things like CHS that happen a lot more in black market operations. So, anyways, I think we could have had a much stronger, much more robust industry if we had cannabis reschedulization or deschedulization on some timetable. And whether that had happened just recently or whether it happened a couple of years ago when this was all first getting bandied about. But it's tough. I mean, the anti-drug forces are still out there. And we still, like here in Washington State, we absolutely have folks at the Liquor and Cannabis Board who think that both liquor and cannabis are terrible and evil. And they, work for the agency that regulates them, and they want us strongly regulated. That's kind of their, the way they look at things. Is their job is to make sure that our products are kind of reined in, which I think is really misguided. I would say that, Colorado and Washington, I'm sure you know these statistics, but it's interesting. We know that a lot in those states, we see a lot less folks going for therapy. We see a lot less prescriptions being written for anxiety and for sleep. And we see a lot less public money being spent on prosecution and incarceration of people for low-level drug crimes. So the dividend is real. I mean, legalization is and it's funny, you even see a state like Oklahoma, which honestly, if you had asked me to rate, like, take all 50 states and put them in order, who do you think's going to be the last? I would have put Oklahoma last, or maybe Missouri, right? Like, there's a couple of Arkansas, there's a few vying for the Louisiana. They're way the hell down on that list. But Oklahoma, that whole story is hysterical, and it's classic, which is, they had Oklahoma State Police out by the Colorado line. And then they even at one point had spotters in Colorado at the shops, taking pictures of people's license plates that were Oklahoma license plates and radioing them to Oklahoma State troopers so that the troopers knew who to pull over. Anyways, long story short is Oklahoma ended up legalizing largely because they knew they were losing massive amounts of tax revenue to Colorado. And so at the end of the day, the combination of losing the tax revenue and then also recognizing that you're spending all this money, and in some states it's a lot of money because they are using private prisons, that they pay a certain amount for every person that's incarcerated. They don't even own their own prisons. So the long story short is that the economics are pretty compelling from a state level. I still feel like in a perfect world, we're going to end up in a situation where all of the states have legalized at some level. And again, I've been surprised by the some of the states that have dug their heels in and are very far away from legalizing have really surprised me. Like Idaho. Right. Idaho is surrounded by states that have legalized, and they basically at this point have really dug in their heels about they'll never ever legalize is kind of the way it's kind of the way they're behaving. But then again, that government has become unbelievably conservative. In the last just 5 years, it's gone unbelievably conservative. So the funny thing is that I've always felt and always wondered, how you square a conservative policy and a desire to have a low tax environment for your citizens with the fact that legalizing cannabis creates a lot of revenue, and the fact that legalizing cannabis saves states a lot of money. And so if I was a conservative, I would be looking at those things. And as a liberal, I look at the fact that, it was insane. I mean, something like 87% of all cannabis-related arrests in the United States involved a person of color, even though the number of persons of color in the United States is nowhere near 87%. And in some areas where the number was even higher than 87% persons of color, we're talking about an area where they had 3% persons of color, like certain areas of certain states where the arrests were just, so it becomes a social equity situation. Right. And that was actually the one of the things I remember from years and years ago. I'm a long-term deadhead, and I used to run around and see as many shows as I could. And there was a guy who was a Canadian lawyer who was loosely connected to the band, who I met at a show and had a long conversation with. And his whole deal was he was representing people accused of drug crimes. And he was the first person who ever really talked to me back in the day when it was unbelievably illegal. He was one of the first people to talk to me about the social equity aspect of legalization, because I was just looking at it as a white guy who had friends in prison. And he was like, you don't even realize that for every one of your friends that's in prison, there's 20 black guys that are in prison. I'm like, holy shit, that's crazy. And so, yeah, at least at that point in time, there were folks connected with the band that were essentially funding this lawyer to help him help people that had no money to fight, unbelievably ridiculous. Somebody gets caught with a 1/4 pound of cannabis back then, and they might be looking at 20 years in prison in Louisiana. And, and no gun, no violence, no other drugs, just cannabis. And so that was the kind of thing that he was fighting against. Right. And so that's one of those things that I think is no matter what price point the cannabis is sold at in a legal store, no matter what people think of the farms or the people who do the packaging or people who make the edibles or what the range of products is or the health of the market or anything else. You can throw that all aside and say just the simple fact that we're not putting as many people in jail is a big deal,
Right.
and everybody in the industry should pat themselves on the back and say good job, because we all have more important things to do with our lives than to spend it being vengeful and retaliating against people who almost certainly didn't hurt anybody.
Right.
Yeah. And at the same time, I totally get it, which is if somebody's involved in harder drugs, somebody's, got weapons, things of that sort, then, or if it becomes like a criminal enterprise with hundreds and hundreds of people involved, that's the sort of thing that the authorities really need to look at. But it's because of all the ancillary things that happen where they are actually hurting people. But yeah, we're the industry has a long way to go, but it's already done a lot of good.
Yeah, bit by bit, baby steps. Things are moving faster but slower than we want them to be. So hopefully we'll see the change.
Well, and that's the nature of history and the nature of progress, yeah. Right? I mean, everything always seems to be just on the verge of culminating, and that's totally normal. The people who are advocating for the change never comes fast enough.
Yeah.
The mass of the population, the change seems overwhelming. There's so much change that happens so quickly, and particularly now. I mean, it's kind of funny. The wave of legalization happened quickly, but the last couple of months have just been insane in terms of the amount of things that have happened, and to the point where the mind almost can't. It's future shock. I don't know if you're familiar with the Alvin Toffler book, but he talked about how the media and the pace of change, the amount of information that people get, was creating essentially people who are dazed and confused because there's so much happening. And this was written in the 70s, and he pretty much nailed it in terms of where we are now and the fact we have computers in our pocket that'll, tell us every last little thing that's going on all around the world at every moment. It's more information than we can take in.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think, I don't know the exact stat, so whoever's listening, don't quote me exactly, but it's something along the lines of we've consumed more information in the past month than, people 60 years ago would have consumed in their entire life, right? And it's just because the little phone in our pockets just ping, 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 everything, all of our worries, all the things that are going on in the world are now kind of coming into us, and you're exactly right. It is absolutely information overload. Really cool. Last question that I have for you is that we always ask the previous guests the question that they want to ask for the next guest, and then you'll have a shot to ask the next guest what they want to ask. This question is from Tony Billmeyer. He's from Blue Sage Cannabis, and he asks, if your business had a 5 million injection of capital, what would you do with it, and how would you grow your business to an optimal size using that capital?
Yeah, I think given where we're at in Washington State, if we had that sort of capital injection, what we would absolutely do would be to invest in a new, updated, upgraded storefront. Mm-hmm. With proper parking, good signage, good street frontage, etc. 5 million is enough in Seattle that you can, actually, to be honest, I even know the property I'd probably go buy. It's a real fixer-upper at a couple million, and it's in a legal spot. And it's the sort of thing where probably if that was the budget, 5 million, we'd rip it down. We'd build a new building. It'd take, a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years, because that's what it takes here in Seattle. But at the end of that process, we would have something where it was a more organized situation that would leverage, our brand and cement kind of a permanent spot in the neighborhood that we've been operating in. Along those same lines, it would also allow us to build in a lot more security features where, when you're leasing, there's only so much you can do to prep a property and make it as safe as you can, but there's always compromises. If we were purpose building something, there's a bunch of things that I know I would build in, knowing now what I know. And so that would be good for us and for our staff so that, when we lock up the shop and go home at the end of the night, we don't have to worry about it. And when we're not at the shop and there are staff there, we don't need to worry about their safety. So, that's what I would do, with that. And I think that would be a wise choice for almost anybody, in the industry, in the sense that, commercial real estate's always going to have, some value. There are lots of things that you could spend $5 million on, and if it didn't go well, you just wouldn't have $5 million. At the very least, at the end of that process, you'd have an interesting, nice piece of property that that other shops, if you were unable to actually lever it and make a bunch of money from it, at least you'd have a piece of property that other shops might be interested in buying. So that's what I would do.
Right. And what question would you have for the next guest that we interview?
So I would be really interested for the next folks I'm wondering if they have any ideas for how to make I'll say the industry healthier when it comes to places like Washington and Oregon and Colorado, where it appears that we have an imbalance in the amount of cannabis that's being grown versus the amount of cannabis that's being sold out of shops. And you have wholesale prices that are plummeting, and you have retail prices that are plummeting to the point where it's hard to function as a retailer, it's hard to function as a farm. I'm wondering what ideas they might have to improve the situation. I don't have any illusions that somebody's going to be able to fix everything, but in a 5-minute answer in a podcast. But
can you still hear me?
I'm curious what they would do to try to improve the situation. What do they think would be a few steps that would make things better?
Right. Perfect. And lastly, I know you have a lot of plans in the future for your store and what you want to do, but please take this time to plug, anything you want, whether it's about your store, things that you want to work on in the future and stuff like that. Please go ahead.
Well, what I would say is that actually, my shop is currently on a hiatus. We had our building, actually 7 buildings, including ours, are ripped down, and they're redeveloping it with condos and stuff. We've been unable to find a new location. So I will give a 2-part plug. If you know of interesting retail cannabis legal real estate in Seattle, please contact Brandon, and he'll get a hold of me because I would love to lease your property, and I'd be happy to tell you more about my background and everything else. And then along the same lines, I'm fully aware of the fact that there are folks that are really interested in the Seattle market that might even have lines on property or own property, but they don't have a license. So I would love to hear from folks like that too, because given the right situation, I would absolutely be willing to partner with somebody and help them open up a shop using our license. So those are 2 distinct possibilities, and if you are interested in either of them, get a hold of Brandon and he'll put you in touch with me.
Awesome. Bob, really appreciate you sharing your words of wisdom. We're going to get the store up and running for you. When that happens, we'll run part 2.
Well, and in the meantime, I really enjoyed my I've enjoyed my semi-retirement. It's there's always running a shop full time for over 9 years. There's lots of little things that pile up, and I've been able to get some of that stuff off my to-do list while we've been running around looking for property. So.
Nice. Look, life is there to enjoy, not to work all the time. I think I have to remind myself that as well. But until next time, I'm your host, Brandon Kwan, founder of Cannabis Marketing and your host of the Dispensary Marketing Podcast. Until next time, I'll see you guys later. Bye. Hey, according to YouTube, this is the best next video for you. Go ahead and click it now.